Welcome, everybody, to today's webcast. This is Nick Cavalancia from Techvangelism. I am really excited that you're here today. We're going to wait just about maybe 2 minutes or so, maybe 3 minutes, just kind of a couple late stragglers coming in to give everybody a chance to get situated. You know, you've got your Coke or your water bottle or something like that. Hopefully you don't have an alcoholic drink. Unless it's after hours, go right ahead. We don't care. Or during hours if you want to get fired. That's fine either way. But get yourself situated. Couple of minutes. We're going to get started. So sit tight. And we're looking really forward to today's webcast. Thanks again for waiting. Let's go ahead and get started with today's webcast. Again, my name is Nick Cavalancia from Techvangelism. Welcome today. Thanks for joining us, everyone. You know, I'm really excited about today's webcast because normally when you attend any kind of webcast, it's usually about a little bit about the technology that's necessary and a lot about the problem. And the presumption today is that you guys already kind of are aware of the insider threat problem. That's why you're on today's webcast. And so instead, what we've decided to do is to try and build a set of slides and a set of educational information today that is really going to provide you some value on how to build an insider threat program. Obviously, you can't cover it all in about an hour's time or so, but we're going to do our best to at least cover what I'm going to call the highlights, for lack of a better term. Now, I'm joined today by James Henderson. And Jim is the CEO of Insider Threat Defense. You kind of see that there up on the slide. He's also chairman of the National Insider Threat Special Interest Group. He's got 15 years of experience protecting classified information up to the, and it says here, top secret SCI level. And Jim, I'm assuming that's not a made-up term because I have no idea. So I'm glad that you know that. Jim's also been involved in the development, implementation, and management of insider threat programs, information assurance programs for the U.S. government agencies, for defense contractors, state governments, and large and small businesses. Got lots and lots of experience today. He's develops and teaches an insider threat program management training course. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of today's webcast as well. And that course has been taught to over 500 organizations, including Fortune 500 companies. And he also provides consulting services in the area of insider threat program development and management, and performs insider threat vulnerability assessments. So that's a mouthful, but I think it's necessary. Jim, really glad to have you. So thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Glad to be part of the webinar.
Yep, glad to have you as well. So for you guys in the audience, today's webinar is going to be a little bit of a different format. We've got maybe it's 10 slides or so, but not death by PowerPoint for sure. And this is far more of sort of a conversational type of format that Jim and I are going to do a little bit back and forth, talking about the different aspects of what's necessary to build an insider threat program. So a couple of things that we want you to kind of keep in mind. One, because it's not death by PowerPoint, we're not going to be putting slide upon slide upon slide. So sometimes while we're talking, you might be seeing the same slide for 1 or 2 or 3 minutes. It's possible. So don't think that something's wrong with your interface there. We're doing just fine on this end. The other thing here is that we want to involve you in on the conversation. I've got the Q&A box open here, and as we're talking, if you've got questions, rather than having necessarily a set of Q&A time at the end, which we still have kind of allotted for, we'd love to have you engage in the conversation while we're talking, so that way it's more contextual around the issues that are going on. So put open that Q&A box. As we're talking, you have the opportunity to ask, very specific questions of Jim, myself, happy to answer those. So feel free to do those as we're going along here. So let's jump in. And what we're going to do first is we're going to start with a couple of definitions. And the reason here is everyone doesn't necessarily always come to these with the exact same assumptions. They're presuming certain things about certain definitions. So we want to start with a couple things to kind of level set a little bit here. And the first one here is just around what you'd even consider an insider threat. Most people have some kind of idea that it might just be, well, obviously it's a malicious insider, well, but maybe not to everybody else. Jim and you and I talked about this a little bit on the last webinar we did together. Would you go into a little detail and just talk a little bit about why the definition of an insider threat and having that established first is really important, maybe some of the various definitions that are possible?
Well, thanks, Nick. Well, there are the standard definitions, the Carnegie Mellon, the DoD, and the NISPOM, operating manual have. But then we go with which is, threats to classified information, such on. Then when you look at the expanded definition, and many times before somebody becomes an insider threat, they're just a disgruntled employee. Another definition: workplace violence, bullying, sexual harassment, terrorism, espionage, fraud, theft, data destruction. I mean, what can hurt your organization sort of needs to be defined up front, for the scope of the program. Are you just going to, look at data destruction and data theft, or are you going to consider workplace violence part of your program?
That's a really good point, just because the fact that the execution of the strategy, particularly like you and I have talked about, looking at like user activity monitoring and things like that on the very far tail end of this discussion at some point down, 35 minutes from now. But obviously what you're looking for changes. So it's really important for you guys in the audience to think about what you consider an insider threat. The other thing here is thinking about what are the assets of value. Jim, you talked about several kinds of threat actions, which is sort of, I think, where your head always sits and where a lot of the definitions they kind of revolve around. And for you guys in the audience, you've got to think about what is of value. You certainly can think of things that are like personally identifiable information, health information, credit card data, intellectual property. I mean, there's kind of a common list, if you will, of the kinds of information that have quote unquote value. But Jim, I know, and we've talked about this as well before, what's of value to the organization isn't necessarily what's of value to the individual. Would you agree?
Yes, and we discussed that on a previous webinar. I mean, many cases organizations will do, and this is sort of a tough one, a data inventory, and say, okay, these are my most critical assets. Well, possibly, maybe those assets are, being protected very well. So what's an insider going to do if he wants some asset of value, whether it's computer hardware, whether it's a pricing list? He's going to go maybe down to the next level and get what's readily available to him that might not be as protected as, let's call it, the really nice chocolate cookie in the cookie jar, right? The other little sugar cookies are just sitting down there. So that's what I've seen in many times, that companies will protect their critical assets, but sometimes just leave all the other assets dangling there. And then that's what the insiders will go after, the malicious insiders, let's say.
That's an excellent point. Sometimes the assets of value might be something that you guys, as part of the IT infrastructure for your organization, you're not thinking of them as having value. So, for example, someone might actually go and take, let's say they work in accounts payable, and all they're doing is taking a listing of all of the vendors that the company does business with. Why? Because they're thinking of starting their own business that does the same thing that your company does, and they want to go reach out to all those vendors. Yeah, so that may or may not hurt your business. That remains to be seen. But the idea is that that's the asset of value to the individual. Also reminds me of that joke story about the company that gets word that someone's stealing every day from the company. So every day they stop every employee and see what they're doing. And this guy walks out with a wheelbarrow. Have you heard this joke, Jim? He's walking out with a wheelbarrow and he's got his
Yeah, I
stuff
think
in there. And the security guard checks the wheelbarrow and it's got that guy's lunchbox and his own tools and whatever. So they let him go by. And the joke kind of goes on and on. It's not really a funny joke, but just an interesting anecdote. And at the end of the day, you realize the guy's just stealing wheelbarrows, because every day he's walking out with a wheelbarrow full of his stuff. He's stealing wheelbarrows every day. You didn't think the wheelbarrows were were a legitimate asset of value. Apparently, they are. So let's if we take these definitions of what you consider an insider threat to your organization, for you guys in the audience, and what the assets of value are, so you can figure out what you need to be watching. Then comes the question of sort of what are the goals, and I've put of the actual program. I've got a couple of examples that I've put up here. Things like you might look at what are the actual threats that we might have potentially, because some of you might be wanting to look early on to look at maybe leading indicators of a threat action, as opposed to watching for the specific threat action. Maybe you're trying to detect the insider threat as it's happening as well. Maybe looking at trying to figure out inadvertent breaches where someone's the unwitting participant. For example, someone accidentally shares something that's posted and available out on the web, and you want to try and find those kinds of threats to the organization as well. Maybe identify specific malicious actions going on, someone printing lots of documents, someone copying a bunch of files. Maybe there's very specific things you're looking for, or you're trying to be able to investigate once something has happened, and you're thinking about where your goals are. And these are just, this is a list of 5. There could be more. But I mean, Jim, what are some of the goals you normally see when organizations are building a threat program?
Well, I first want to start by saying sometimes I think people think, and we'll probably cover this later, that the insider threat program is a witch hunt. What I see a good insider threat program is a group of stakeholders within the company getting together to do it better. Because in many cases, companies are doing an okay job. They just need to do it better, and they need to think outside the box. I've said this to you, Nick, many times. Business process improvement. What are your security foundations? Does that, the goals of the program need to be to protect the assets, the people, the assets that have value, whether it's pricing lists like you talk about, whether it's sensitive information, classified information. I mean, each company is going to be different, and they have to decide what they want to protect. And I think, you need to define up front what the goal of your program is.
And I like the fact that you mentioned business processes. You started talking about security a little bit. There's sort of that ripple effect that's going to happen as well. And in the context of that idea of, for you guys in the audience, if it's just a witch hunt and all you're doing, you're trying to find the thing you think is bad, instead, that ripple effect is going to have some negative impacts, because it's going to cause the rest of the business to have to react to this witch hunt, as opposed to we come up with some very defined goals that are concrete. They establish what we're looking for, and then we can figure out how do we want to accomplish those goals and so on. That ripple effect is going to only, to use the 2 examples you gave, Jim, make those business processes more sound or more secure, as the case might be, as well as ensure the security of the specific kinds of data you're looking for. So let's do this, Jim. Good. You want to say
Nick, can
something
I
else?
jump in and add that
Please.
I think too it's the perception of the program. And some companies, many of my students, when they roll out a program, they've told me they've already come out with a rollout message that comes out from the CEO, whether it's an email, whether it's an all hands meeting, depending on the size of the company. And the CEO gets up there because it's got to come from the top, and he lets everybody know this is not a witch hunt. This is to protect the company from even the CEO, right? Because I've seen CEOs go bad. And when that message comes down that this is not a witch hunt, this is protecting the company, protecting our jobs, protecting the individuals, God forbid an employee, there should be a workplace violence, then I think it starts to resonate, and the employees begin to realize this isn't a witch hunt. This is to protect our jobs, our livelihood, everything.
No, no, good point. And I like the fact that you're talking about the CEO and having that support at the top, because that actually helps me segue into my next slide. Obstacles to getting an insider threat program up and running. Now, I've got a list of, I come up with 7 of them. I should have probably added in like executive support as an 8th one. So I'm going to just leave that up there, and as that's pretend it's there as a bullet. And we've already kind of talked about it. You definitely have to have executive level support. But what I'd like to do, Jim, if we can, let's walk through each one of these bullets that I've got on this slide I'm about to put up here.
Okay.
Let's talk about them a little bit. The first one, obviously, we'll keep going. Executive level support. This obviously is something that has to come from the top. Otherwise, if just IT trying to do it, it's not going to be successful. Would you agree?
I agree. No, it's got the buy-in and support. It's got to come from the top.
Yeah, especially there's one farther down when we're talking about stakeholders, where you're going to build a team, and if you don't have executive level support, the rest of the team isn't going to support the initiative either. So the first bullet that I've got printed anyways here, so you guys have to pretend, those of you in the audience, there's like an executive buy-in above that, is the issue of privacy. Because one of the things you're going to be doing in order to make a successful insider threat program work, you have to be watching the employees' activity, their behavior, potentially doing analytics. You're going to be invading some degree of privacy. There's obviously the question of, well, it's work related, so is it really their privacy? Yes, all that stuff comes into play. It comes in the mix, but it has to be dealt with, and it can be an obstacle for some organizations because they don't want this to become too big brother-ish. Jim, thoughts?
I think the problem with the privacy is, and it's no disrespect to any attorneys online, but this is what I hear from students, is that a lot of legal general counsel within these companies are privacy, oh, you can't monitor. I think it's the ECPA, Electronic Communications Privacy Act. There is a little blurb in there about, companies can monitor their employees. And so privacy, I think, is one of the main ones I see sometimes. Employees are like, or companies are a little reluctant when they don't know that much about putting in a program about the privacy piece. One attorney I know real well, his name is Mr. Thompson, said, there's a difference between Facebook privacy and there's a difference between and that whole thing that was in the news, and then the privacy of monitoring employees. It's two different things. Companies can monitor their employees. Yes, there are certain things that you might not be able to monitor, like their banking. Are you looking at things, or a communication, attorney-client privilege, or communication with their doctor? But for the most part, you can monitor people.
No, totally agree. Let's go to the second one, funding. This kind of a program is not just something you're putting on paper. It's going to involve people's time. There's going to be an entire team that needs to be put together. So there are meetings that are going to have to reoccur. There are processes, procedures that have to be put into play. There's going to maybe have to be some legal documents that are going to have to be drafted. There are solutions that have to be purchased, people that have to monitor those solutions, and have a team that's ready to react based on things that are collected, like for if someone, let's say a user activity determines that someone's maybe stealing a bunch of data and copying it to a USB stick, someone's going to have to react. So there's definitely a need for funding here, up front. Jim, is it do you think it has to be as defined as spell the whole thing out and then ask for funding, or is it more like you just need to make sure that there's at least a nod that funding will be approved to some degree and then figure out the specifics later?
I think funding, and I think that's another misconception, that insider threat programs cost a lot of money. First, you define your scope and what you're going to cover. Of course, yes, if you buy a user activity monitoring behavior analytics tool, that's going to cost some money. But the initial part of getting the stakeholders together, I guess you could say that does cost money, because you're taking the HR and the legal and the IT person and getting them in a room, and that may be taking them away from their jobs. But initially, it's getting everybody to work together. If you're deciding to hire a full-time insider threat program manager, yes, that might cost you money. But if you're just using your security person who's going to be dual-hatted and sort of be the security person but be the insider threat program manager, is that really costing any more money? It's costing more time. So initially, I don't see the program, for better words, costing a lot. It's down the road as you expand your program, maybe buy tools, do different things, more training, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it might be start small, grow larger if you have to, but like you
Yes.
said, it's not too expensive. The next one is culture. I mentioned the term Big Brother a couple minutes ago, and for some organizations, the culture it just seems like they don't want to be the Big Brother. They don't want to have to do that to their employees. But the reality is that the culture has to change to recognize the fact that the organization has viable, I should say, valuable documents, valuable information that, if taken, if stolen, if destroyed, if modified, whatever the case is, that it may hurt the organization. Certainly not just from their reputation for being in the news headlines from a data breach or so on, but like there was a couple stories a few years ago of some program manager from one software company took a bunch of intellectual property, stuck it up on a cloud drive of some kind, and was going to a new job at a competitor, and was taking all of the documents in terms of what the roadmap was, everything with him. That hurts. And so the culture may need to change, especially this goes back to the idea of having executive buy-in, because you are going to change the culture of the organization, certainly from a standpoint of we're watching, we're monitoring, and we're going to respond to incidents. Jim, thoughts about the culture?
You're perfectly right on that. And what you were talking about is asking employees to, for better words, tattle on each other. Employees will sometimes, there have been many cases where things have happened, employees have just turned the other way. It could be their best friend, but then they didn't realize, let's say down the road, and I've actually seen cases where this has happened, nobody wanted to say anything, then maybe they had to lay off 80 employees of that division, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know you don't want to tattle on your friend. So where I'm going with this is the traditional insider threat program will ask employees to report on other employees that are displaying indicators of concern. That's beneficial to the organization, right? Is it really beneficial to the employee that's tattling on Nick? No. So then the other ways that you can do a positive incentive is to engage employees, is to ask them to report security weaknesses, right? And maybe do a security rewards program. So it's not so much as you're tattling on somebody, but it starts to change the culture. Like, wow, I saw this. And you say something to security. Security can't be everywhere every day, right? So it's like you have, let's say, whether it's 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 people, and you have this security rewards program. It's almost like you have, let's say the company has 1,000 people, 1,000 sensors that you're paying as sort of like in-house consultants, if that, and I've seen companies actually do this, and it changes the culture because people report things. They realize it's there to protect the company.
No, totally agree. I'm going to do this. I want to put the next four up together because I think they're kind of interrelated to a degree. And that's HR, legal, stakeholders, and employees. And the reason why I'm putting them all together for you guys in the audience is that each one of these represents a slightly different interest in the organization, but each one is simply going, wait a second, you can't do that because. So HR might say, oh, that's going to disrupt employees. They're going to think they're always watching. They're not going to trust the organization. It's not a good place to work. Legal saying, oh, well, we can't record that information. You gave the great example about like banking or stuff that's, attorney-client privilege and things like that. Legal might bring that up. The stakeholders themselves might say this is going to be disruptive. Everyone's got a little bit of a different opinion about it. Jim, are there any one or more of these four that usually stand out when you're doing one of your programs?
I mean, what I see traditionally, unfortunately, is HR getting picked on. But I've had a really good speaker at one of my, the National Insider Threat Specialist Group meetings from Novetta. Her name is Davida, and she is actually the HR person. It's amazing how they've got that company working as far as the Insider Threat Program the HR supporting the Insider Threat Program. They realize that HR is there to protect the people, for better words, but it's also there to protect the company. So I guess where I'm going with this, HR is picked on a lot. I've seen legal have, the sort of not more gatekeepers than enablers. You can't do this. Stakeholders, I remember one of my classes towards the end, the two guys that were attending the class said, oh, I see this is going to be a real problem, trying to get some of the, we have remote locations. They're not going to buy into this. I said, that's where your CEO needs to talk to them. You're trying to put in the program, right? Meaning the insider threat program manager. You don't need to be negotiating. It's already been decided you're putting a program. You don't need to be fighting with the stakeholders. So that's where I'm going with the CEO needs to be saying, we're going to do this. So it's really dependent in each organization who could be an obstacle.
Yep, I'm looking to see. We have a question here. Oh, this is back to, so here's interesting. So Christopher says it's the same concept as every soldier as a sensor and sort of the see something, say something model. So the biggest obstacle is still buy-in that it's acceptable to report on your buddy. So how do you overcome this at higher levels? What's your thought there, Jim?
Let me look at the question here. It was again, how do you overcome the
How do you overcome the
tattling?
idea that the tattle mentality, thinking that it's okay to tattle on your employee? You think it's more going back to what you said earlier, try to just and simply create a more of a security focused culture in the organization and then let those things happen naturally?
I mean, if you go back and look, I know the tattling. So, okay, Nick, you're the security person, and Sally's my friend. I don't want to tattle on Sally. I have lunch with her every day, but I know Sally's doing something really bad. Well, maybe you have an anonymous tip line. Maybe you have a way that somebody can anonymously report stuff, even though, yeah, this may hurt your friend Sally. They may look into her actions, but in the long run, who knows? Maybe they won't fire Sally. Maybe she hasn't dug her grave, as they would say, right? In the long run, it helps the company. If you looked a couple of years back at the Association of Computer Forensics Examiners report, out of the 1,300 cases, I think it was 13 or 14 or 1,200, 50% of those came in through the anonymous tip line. And I've had some people in my class say, "Well, we don't want to deal with anonymous." Well, then, would you rather have something or nothing?
Yeah.
Right. So I've also seen too where companies do incentives on performance reviews. So let's say that Nick, you were hoping you were going to get a 10 on your or a 9.5 and get that promotion, but maybe you did something security related that this has happened a couple times, Nick, and I'm sorry I can't give you that 9.5. You're getting an 8.7. If you do the performance review, so there's actually a section on security where if you can hit that 10 mark, who knows? Maybe you'll get that, because security.
I like the example.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's for your reward. You're trying to reward your people.
And I like that thinking because it really does kind of come back to what I was saying earlier about the security culture. So, Christopher, as kind of answer your question as well, it's less about telling people the way that we're going to do this is you tattle on your buddy. Instead, it's more, this is how the organization looks at the issue of security. We take it seriously. Here's a couple of things we put in place. Will people necessarily take advantage of it? Sure, I get the same, maybe the people factor you're talking about. But I think it's more about trying to create a security culture so people understand that the organization takes it seriously, and therefore the employees should take it seriously because they work there.
And Nick, can I add one quick one? A very well known insider threat program manager from a government agency spoke at one of my conferences years ago, symposiums, and he told people right in the beginning, our insider threat program is not meant to derail people's careers. In some cases, they may go off the track and they're coming back. It's to catch the people, maybe help them, give them assistance. Again, in some cases, maybe they've done something with classified information. They broke the law. In other cases, in a government, maybe it's not something that bad, some counseling, some probation. But that's, again, an insider threat program is not a witch hunt. It's not, you're out the door. In many cases, it's trying to get in front of the problem before it becomes a problem.
Yeah, let's do this. Let's keep going. We're about halfway down the hour. We still have a bunch of slides. We want to make sure we cover this. And for you guys in the audience, if we go a little long, we're not trying not to. But if we do, stay with us. This is all really good stuff. Chris says, nice comments. Thank you. So you're quite welcome. So the next part here is building the insider threat program team. And there's a couple of key stakeholders that you definitely need to have. And this list is going to look rather familiar because we've talked about, I think, almost all of these already. In fact, I'm just going to outline them here and just kind of stick them out here. And the reason for having each of these, senior management makes sense. You already heard Jim say, if you're having problems with HR or legal or someone's not getting in line with it, they're saying we don't want to do that, you need somebody higher up going, no, we're doing this as an organization, so get on board. But you want someone from human resources, as you're going to see a little later on. Human resources is a great source of intelligence around who might be a potential threat in the organization. You need legal on board because of things like having, let's say, a confidential intellectual property agreement, a SEPA agreement, put it when the person first joins the organization, things like that. You want those people involved. Of course, IT, you guys, because you're going to be putting security solutions in place, I should say solutions in place. And then if you're big enough to have a separate security team, those folks might be the ones actually monitoring user behavior, user activity. Maybe they're the ones just doing the response actions that need to be done, whatever the case is. Jim, have I missed anybody in terms of roles that need to be on the ITP team?
One is, I mean, maybe it's a given. It's supervisors and managers. They're the closest to the employee, other than the employee themselves. They see stuff, hear stuff before probably HR or IT will, right? So having your supervisors and managers engaged is very critical. I'll give you, if I can, a quick 30-second. Saw a very defense contractor, very robust program, a lot of monitoring tools. So, I know the person that works on the program. Long and short story is the supervisor had a concern about the employee. What did the supervisor do? Nothing, because he thought his employee was too important. What did the employee unfortunately do? Went home and killed somebody. Yes, I know that's a very, sorry for the people online, but these are the realities sometimes. Maybe if this manager had spoke up, maybe the insider threat program, HR could have gotten in front. Maybe there could have been some increased monitoring. Maybe they could have gotten in front of prevented this. I mean, whether the person was somebody who died at home or, I'm not sure who actually outside the workplace died. It doesn't matter. It could have been somebody inside.
Yeah, you just don't know. The last part of this about the ITP team is just having a designated senior official, someone who's running the program. Jim, of the people that we've talked about, the ones that are bulleted on the screen there, the ones that you added in, who ends up normally being sort of the senior official of the program?
It varies. And I want to add, some people call it insider threat program senior official. I've seen that term more used in the defense contracting area. Is government and business usually sometimes call it maybe an insider threat program manager. I've seen for the defense contractors facility security. I've seen in some defense contractors, they just hire somebody. I've seen it even fall under the IT department. I've actually think I've even seen it fall under HR. It just really, I guess, depends on the level of knowledge somebody has, and the company's like, well, it's cheaper to probably put the program here than for right now than to go hire somebody. So I've really seen it all over the place, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, no, I would agree. So the next topic we've got here is just the essential elements for an insider threat program. The first one I think we've already talked about, which is having executive buy-in. You're going to be looking for funding. You're going to be looking for support from the different departments. So you got to have that. So I think we've already kind of beaten that one, not dead, right, but we've got that one pretty good. So let's jump on to the second one, which is communication between departments. And the reason why this is really important, you just heard Jim give an example about it, like a department supervisor, kind of a line of business owner, something like that, someone who's in the trenches doing the work. And you need that person to be communicating to somebody else. We've also talked about even having the anonymous, tip line, or maybe it's a web form or whatever the case is, but you need this communication going on. And I put here that it's kind of the basis for the framework that you're going to build. I'm going to show you an example a little later on of an incident response plan, just a couple of sets of actions that need to take place. And just when you're coming up with these formal processes that have to happen, it does involve a lot of cross-department communication. So this is really critical. Jim, thoughts on this one?
Well, I think understanding that the old ways of doing business basically are not up to protecting an organization's assets. I mean, we're so technology focused now, right? Everything is digital, the data, everything. So the ways of doing businesses before of just locking the doors and guns and guards, right, are different. I think, and we probably beat this one to death too, a lot of this is business process improvement, doing it better. Oh, we're not doing that. Well, why aren't you doing that? Oh, because we're not. Well, why? Like, many times I see, well, we're not monitoring USB ports, so we're not locking them down. Okay, so you don't have to lock them down, but do you at least know who's copying stuff to your USBs? No. Well, then how do you know they're stealing? So I look at a lot of this is business process improvement. I already said the old ways of doing business and going beyond compliance regulations. You got to think outside the box. Why? Because a malicious insider will.
Yep, good point. The last one I've got on here is visibility and employee behavior. You gave just the perfect example a moment ago of is someone copying something to a USB stick. You guys, in order to make this work, you must have an ability to see what the employee is doing. And I've got kind of two parts here. I put the computer and HR. That's just the two ways I could sort of characterize it. And what I mean by that is you've got to be able to see what the employee is doing on their computer. And then you also have to be very tapped in to your HR organization, assuming that they definitely have their thumb on the pulse of the organization, because there are leading indicators. If HR finds out that so-and-so's spouse just came down with cancer and you heard that they spent every dollar they had trying to fight the cancer and they're still going at it, that might indicate that's maybe there's a potential issue there, because now they're trying to figure out how to get money. Are they a threat necessarily? No, but that is a source of intelligence that you want. So you need visibility into how the employee's acting at work. Are they doing fine in their reviews? Have they been written up by HR 7 times? Things like that. So in the real world it matters, and then also what they're doing on their computer matters. Jim?
Yeah, I'll try to give a real short example. Bob's sitting in his cubicle. He's very upset on the phone to his wife. Blah, 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 blah. I didn't get this performance review I wanted. I'm not getting a promotion. I'm out of here. So it's a lot of blah, blah, blah for 3 or 4 days. Maybe he's even using nasty words on the phone, and his cubicle mate finally says something to HR. Well, what could HR do? Nothing. Tell him to stop cursing, spend more time on work than on the phone. So if you take that to the next level, and you involve all the other departments, and you go to security and you say, hey, I've got some issues with Bob. This is HR going to security. Can you tell me anything that's might be out of norm for him? Oh, he's coming in every Sunday from 9 to 12. Then you go and talk to IT. Oh, he's plugging in his USB. Oh, he's burning up the printer. Then it goes from not Houston, we have a problem, to Houston, we might have a problem, right? And you're involving the other departments. Then, maybe you involve another, maybe you go back and talk to the supervisor, and the supervisor goes, well, I didn't know he was working Sunday. So something as little as a guy, verbal indicators could turn into be the guy stealing from the company.
Yeah, no, good point there. So as you guys are building this program, there's going to be a number of, I put as documents and notices that are going to get involved. It's not just the process of, we got to buy a piece of software and stick it in and start watching people. It's not just that. There's a lot more that needs to go into play. And Jim, I thought we'd talk about, I got 5 different ones we'd talk about a little bit here. The first one is all the kinds of background checks. In general, you might do background checks, credit checks, references, those kinds of things. Why do you think those are critical as part of an insider threat program?
Well, they're critical when you're bringing in, say, Nick, you're a new hire. They're critical to bring you in to make sure you're a good employee. You're a good employee. Yeah. Only problem with them is they're a point-in-time snapshot of Nick. They're not a continuous snapshot. And what I've seen I want to say in most cases, insider threat programs are only gathering internal data sources. And they might not have all the nuggets, I call them the nuggets they need. There are third-party services that can provide you the external nuggets, right? They give you that continuous snapshot of Nick. If I can give you like a 30-second example, Global Airline used a third-party service to continuously monitor all its employees. They signed up the entire airline, 60,000 people. Within the first 45 days of signing up, 1,700 things came back of concern. 55 of those people have been arrested. I'd say that would be a concern to the insider threat program. So, background checks, credit checks are great. Yes, for the people who have clearances like me and all, it's a requirement. But for the people, you might be employing somebody that you might not even do a background credit check or do continuous monitoring. These things are critical. I mean, it's important, and it's actually not that expensive.
Particularly if the role in question is going to have access to some critical, valuable, protected data of some kind.
Very good point, Nick. You don't have to sign up the entire company. Maybe the people in finance, maybe the people in engineering that have access to those critical assets.
Yeah, I know that's been done. So I mentioned a SEPA a little early on. This is a document, and there's some examples on Veriato's website. I know because I've written some papers on this. But the idea with the SEPA is basically to establish with the employee when they first join the organization that everything that they're doing at the company is considered confidential. These kinds of documents are definitely confidential. This is what we consider intellectual property. And then usually there's some kind of note there and that says if you're ever unsure as to whether something should be confidential or considered intellectual property, you should err on the side that it is. That kind of thing. And the reason why you do this is, one, you're setting the tone for when the employee first gets there, but two, this same document gets used particularly when the employee is exiting the organization, whether it's voluntary or not. The very first thing that happens is you have HR sit them down and go, we just want to give you this copy of this document you signed when you first got here so that you know that we expect you to adhere to it, because you're legally bound by it. It's a reminder that this all is confidential. If you're planning on leaving and you give us a 2-week notice, don't be stealing anything, is kind of the idea there. Jim?
I think, definitely you need those confidentiality agreements. I'd probably jumping ahead here, but you need the acceptable use policy.
I'll put it up there. Keep going.
Okay. Security acknowledgement agreement, which is, basically, I'm reading your mind, Nick.
That's right. Fine.
So, well, an acceptable use policy, security acknowledgement agreement, I guess could be the same thing. And then the login banners. Let's see if I'm reading your mind on that one.
Yeah. Yes, you are.
The one key thing here is your acceptable use policy, your security acknowledgement, your login banners should all read the same. What I mean, the security acknowledgement agreement might be more in depth, the policy may be more general, but when I mean the verbiage needs to read the same, is if you ever let Nick go because he did something wrong, a defense attorney might come back, and I've actually seen this happen, and say, the login banner said one thing, but the document he signed said another. You want those to pretty much read the same. That's why legal is very important in reviewing those documents.
Yeah, and some organizations have gone as far in the AUP document to put in things like monitoring, that your activity, a general statement, your activity at work may be monitored. You should have no reasonable expectation of privacy while you're at work. Those kind of things. Most organizations that do any kind of user activity monitoring, where you're truly watching everything the employee does, they typically won't acknowledge that to the employee. Like, it doesn't say in the acceptable use policy, we're recording everything you do and every keystroke, because you want to see the normal behavior of the individual. If they know that they're being monitored on the computer because you told them so, well, they're just going to go ahead and take their phone out and videotape what they're doing on the screen instead. And now you have no record that they did anything bad and that kind of thing. So they typically at least just say, to Jim's point about having a sort of a legal defense if something was to go down, there's at least something in there that does establish for the employee that they have no reasonable expectation of privacy. And by the way, when Jim and I have both talked about this, because he mentioned this early on about how you can do this and the employees don't have privacy, specifically in the US, that's always the case. In other countries, like you take a country like Germany, not the case. Their labor unions get involved and things like that. And like, I know that Veriato has a customer, as an example, in Germany, where in order to have the software installed, there has to be sort of a 2 missile key system. The labor union head has one half of the password to go and review someone's actions, and the head of HR, the head of security, whoever it is inside the organization, has the other half of the password. And that way, there's sort of a 2 missile key system in order to get past or get access to the ability to go ahead and watch and review what someone's been doing. So that idea of privacy is definitely important, but I think the big issue here with these last three is to make sure, I like what you said, Jim, make them all in agreement, so that way the user is constantly being reinforced the fact that we could be monitoring you. What you do at work is important. Security matters. Don't steal stuff. Whatever it is you want to tell them inside those banners, but make sure that you have that done. So yeah,
can I add real quick?
Please.
Very large defense contractor in my class. They build airplanes. They brought up something that I had never thought of. Is that so? If you've got a company of, let's say, 10,000, but 3,000 of those are the people on the shop floor building airplanes, they might be a union. If you're going to be monitoring their actions in their union, you might want to talk to the union, because, of course, like HR is there to protect the employees, the union is there to protect the employees. So you go to try to fire Nick, and the union gets involved. Well, we didn't know you had an insider threat program, and such on. So, I mean, I'm not an expert in union stuff, but this is just what I've heard actually from various students, that you've got to engage the union if you have union employees.
Yep, indeed. So let's talk next about intelligence sources. In this case, this is where are you guys getting your information from? All right, so where do we want to get it from, and what's going to be of benefit to this program? And the first one here is human resources. I've already talked about this a little bit, but you definitely, in fact, Jim, I think even you gave the same example. We talked about the guy in the queue, so maybe we've already done this bullet, but it's going to be a source view. Don't just think about this being a security, a technology type of focused program. This is something where you can really use human activity as a way of getting an idea of where your risks might be. Jim, anything to add on human resources, or should we just keep going?
I have a chart, but it would be overwhelming. There's so many data. I actually put together a chart because I always hear people, and I've got internal, external, HR, IT. There's so many data sources that can potentially help a company. But I think traditionally people just think of IT and HR, but there's a lot of other, security and badge in, badge out.
Yep, I've actually got that here. Physical security is a great one. In fact, I had to use that with somebody where we had an issue. It ended up being an HR issue of someone not coming into work on time, and we literally had to go and pull badge scans just to show that they were opening the door, getting in the elevator, coming in the front door, and they were getting in at like 10 o'clock, and work starts at 8:30. That kind of thing. You have to sit down and go, that's not acceptable. You've got to come in on time. But to your point, that's also going to corroborate other things. If we're wondering, you said, the guy comes in for 3 hours on a Sunday. Well, now you've got physical security to corroborate that evidence. Is that kind of where you're going? Right.
And then you go to talk to IT, the USBs, the printing, and then maybe you go and look at his phone records, and hypothetically, he was dumb enough to be calling the competitor from his phone. So there's so many data sources in an investigation that can potentially help.
Yep, agreed. I've got two other ones here, user behavior analytics and user activity monitoring. I'm going to kind of cover them both. The behavior analytics is analyzing leading indicators typically of what someone's doing. So it could be things like, Jim gave the example of suddenly someone's printing a lot of data. A lot on the printer. That doesn't mean they're doing anything bad. Maybe their boss asked for, I need 500 copies of whatever. But those are leading indicators. It also uses psycholinguistic analytics to look at shifts in the conversations they're having. You gave an example, Jim, that was perfect. You talked about that example of the guy on the phone with his wife, and it happened to be on the phone. But if you think about this in email, maybe for you guys in the audience, this is where UBA kind of comes into play. Changes of things like going from generally positive to generally negative can be a leading indicator of a potential threat. Changes and shifts in the way that they talk, like it used to be a lot of we's and us's, like, I'm really excited that we're going to be going to this show, and I think we're going to be able to get this many leads. You hear all the we's in the sentence there, versus I can't believe that I didn't get the promotion. I deserve that. It's generally negatively toned, and it's all about me. And so UBA can help with those kinds of things, determine leading indicators, and then user activity monitoring is where you're watching literally everything the employee does, and you're trying to see things like what applications are they using, how long are they using them, when do they log in, when do they log off, what are they typing, are they copying files, printing, literally kind of everything you can think of that goes on. Jim, comments on those two together about the use of those as
Yes.
intelligence?
On well, depending on the tool, like say user behavior analytics, you've got 10 people in finance. Nick and me both basically do the same job. Why is my email or copying to USB so much more? Maybe it's nothing. So, that's why I look at user behavioral analytics. I mean, also, with user activity monitoring, again, depending on the tool, you can do keyword lists. Some of these tools come with built-in keyword lists. For anger, you can build your own. Let's say you have a special project called Project Orange or whatever. So anything that goes through the email system that says Project Orange, maybe that's your next generation, whatever, right? Spaceship. And you don't want that going out to anybody. I've actually seen user activity behavior analytics tools for protecting the workforce. True case, there was an email at a government agency. It said, the next time he walks in my office, I'll blow him away. It either said blow him away or kill him. And they got in front of the government psychologist, behavioral psychologist. They said, look into it. It turned out the person admitted not to being on his medication, and it turned out to be a false positive, but it was good they got in front of it. So you can glean a lot of stuff from user activity monitoring, from just, where data's traveling, where's it going, what's going out. There's just so much that can be done that can really give a company a picture of what's going on, a digital footprint.
Yeah, and you actually touched on something that I found very interesting that applies to UBA. You talked about comparing, somebody else, you and someone else do the same job. And for you guys in the audience, if you don't have any kind of UBA solution in place, typically it's going to compare a baseline of, let's say, an individual's activity either against themselves or against a peer group, which could be usually defined within a solution. So that way you're saying, okay, how about a salesperson compared to everybody else in sales? Well, typically everybody in sales prints like 5 documents a week. And that way when this guy goes and suddenly prints 15 documents in a day and then 10 documents the next day, and see, maybe it doesn't go over a threshold that like a UAM solution might say, if you go over a threshold of 50 documents, I got to let somebody in IT know. Maybe they don't do that, but they're doing something very abnormal in comparison to what salespeople normally do. And to Jim's example of like the guy who wasn't on his meds, that the printing may not be an indicator that they actually are stealing information, but it's a leading indicator that there's a potential risk there and someone should review it. And that's why you need these intelligence sources, to Jim's point of having lots of different sources. There's lots of moving parts, and you want to be able to have visibility into all of it.
Right.
The last thing here we've got is building an incident response plan. And the way that I typically think about this when I'm talking to customers is they should be doing this in sort of a scenario-based model. You've got to come up with at least a couple of different scenarios that serve as the foundation for everything that you will do as an incident response plan. And in reality, there aren't that many that you're going to come up with. I mean, Jim and I have talked about a couple different things, everything from Jim's mentioned workplace violence and given a real good example there. We've talked about data being stolen, maybe somebody leaving the organization. I mean, there's just a numbers, a handful that probably based on the goals you have back at the very first slide or so, the goals that you have for the program, you come up with the scenarios that are going to be appropriate for it. And I've got 4 here, and I thought Jim, I'd outline them, and then we talk a little bit about coming up with a response plan, as well as I've got an example here. So you've got one where maybe you're thinking about if you see a leading indicator that there might be a threat, what do you do? So that could be anything from somebody overheard someone saying, oh, I hate my job, I'm leaving, or they thought they saw someone copying files, or whatever the case is, just a leading indicator. Maybe there's something going on, what do you do? And there's a set of responses for that. It could be things like, maybe we'll go to the head of the department and we'll get approval from them to go ahead and review the employee's activity, or whatever the case is for the last 30 days maybe. I mean, there's ways to handle just that, just to review. But then there's active indicators. Maybe we actually, even after the first scenario, we thought they might be doing something, we went and reviewed. Then when we review it, we found that they actually are doing something. Okay, now what do you do? What's the response plan for that? Then maybe an employee giving notice, somebody leaving in 2 weeks, or an employee being terminated. And those are some. And I just wanted to show you here as an example, and then Jim, maybe we could talk about this a little bit here. This is an example of a response plan that I built, where you can see this is for both, this is for involuntary termination, just as the example. So someone being fired, and we know they're going to be fired. And so you can see things like the task that's got to be done. I'm reading through the columns. The role responsible, and this is actually based on what I have for role was the thought process was you have the member that's inside the insider threat program group, and that person is the liaison. They're going to be notified. So that's the responsible role. And there's maybe also a notified role, someone that needs to be notified because of it. So, and then there's also an SLA, like how long do we have to do it? So as the example is on the first one there, prior to involuntary termination, if you know that. If not, then it becomes the day that you're terminating them. The notification. So the manager needs to say, hey, I want to fire this person. They need to notify HR as soon as they possibly can, so that we know the responsible role and the notified role, then notifying IT of the termination and the last day. Then HR needs to tell IT, and the SLAs that tell them immediately, so that IT is ready to make sure that happens. Then we have conducting a plus or minus 30-day activity review, meaning we need to check and see what they've been doing the last 30 days because we're firing them to make sure they haven't done anything wrong. The security team's got to do that. And if they find anything bad, then they need to notify HR and legal immediately. So this is just an example of what you've got to build for those scenarios that you come up with that are based on the goals you have for the program. Jim, thoughts on this?
It's a perfect point, Nick. It's almost like a go-to.
Yeah.
If then, like they used to say in programming, if then, next
Yep.
line. So
Yep.
if employee is being terminated for malicious, whatever, maybe immediately disable network access before you even tell them. I've seen numerous cases where they've known they had a problem with an employee. They told him he was going to be fired. They let him finish out the day. What did he do? He sabotaged the network and pretty much wiped it out. Why? Because, I've actually had students in my class go, well, what do you do when a manager fires somebody and doesn't tell HR? And I'm like, well, the minute you fire somebody, you have a potentially hostile person on their hands, right? Who's upset. Yeah. And if the manager isn't telling HR, you've got a disgruntled employee, right? So getting the managers to understand that they need to communicate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really all going to depend on the situation, depending on whether it's malicious, non-malicious. Again, key points you made, various departments must be involved, HR, security, IT, legal. I've even seen where law enforcement has to be involved because maybe they have a feeling that this person is going to get really violent when you tell them. Other things to consider, terminating facility access, not just at one location, but maybe multiple locations. I've seen where they've terminated the facility access at one location but forgot the others, and then the disgruntled employee's gone into other locations because they didn't disable the access and done harmful things. And then I've also seen them terminate network access but totally forget about the VPN or like web email, and they still come back in and do something. It's very critical when you let them go.
I like that you mentioned the police and get law enforcement involved. So for you guys, as you're thinking about this, one of the reasons for having these in play is because in the most extreme cases, and by extreme I don't mean way over on the one end of the spectrum, but just mean like the case where someone is actively doing something that is bad. They are stealing data from the organization. They are data destruction, exfiltration, whatever they're doing. Those are criminal offenses. And so that's how serious you've got to take this. So I think the fact that you mentioned law enforcement I thought was important because that kind of sets the tone. This is serious stuff. We're talking about somebody stealing from your organization, someone who is potentially going to kill someone, or in the case of the story you actually mentioned, someone actually did kill someone. This is when people go bad. And it's unfortunate that it happens, and we just don't know what's going to make someone crack. The old fraud triangle that used to be used came out like in the 50s or 60s, but it was they have motivation, opportunity, and rationalization. So if they have the motivation, something goes on. Like I give the example of, like, my wife suddenly has cancer, and I've spent every last dime that I have, and now I still need more money to pay for her treatment. Now I'm motivated to try and figure out how to get money. Then I have opportunity, and so I go ahead and I figure out, well, I could probably sell this data over to a competitor, or I know a sales guy over at such and such. Maybe they would give me, whatever it is. Now I have opportunity, and then rationalization is, well, they've never given me a raise in 4 years, and I deserve this, and those kinds of things. And you're rationalizing your actions away. You never know what's going to push somebody right there. That motivation is the first thing pushes them there, and then if they have opportunity and an ability to rationalize, badness happens. So
and Nick, you make a key point. It's hard. I think some companies think they can just look at a magic little globe and go, who knows what the employee is going to do on that given day when something happens, right? Who knows whether he's going to do workplace violence, steal data. It's hard to sometimes predict what they're going to do, right? It's just
right.
I think a big problem, if I can add real quick, is that unfortunately, cyber gets more press. Not that I wish insider threat got more press in the news, but the stories are out there. I have countless stories that when I show to my students, they're like, the employee did what? I said, yeah, he wiped out the entire network, 17,000 workstations and 1,000 servers. Why? Because he didn't get instead of getting a 50 grand bonus, he got 32,000, and he was a little irritated, and he wrote a little script that executed on the network and wiped out the entire network, right down to the PBX and everything. So it's
Yeah, I want to just mention something there, because we don't have a whole lot of questions in the queue, so I just want to keep going. We're almost at the top of the hour right now, and we're basically done, everyone. So don't worry, we're just going to go maybe a minute or two over. In the latest Verizon data breach investigations report, they indicated that insiders were responsible for data breaches 28% of the time. So you can do the math and you go, okay, so external factors is 72% of the time. So I don't have to worry about insiders then. And I'm going to say no, because 28% is actually a massive number, and here's why. I want you to think about this. When you talk about external attacks and external data breaches, a lot of that is automated and opportunistic. If you think back to, if you're as old as I am, and you remember the movie War Games, and you remember Matthew Broderick putting his computer and turning it on and plugging the phone into the little phone jack thing, and he started calling with a war dialer. He would call the prefix that is, in his city there, 352-0000, and then 352-0001. 002, 003, 004. He would keep calling. His computer was calling, war dialing, to see what systems might answer, and he could connect to some BBS of some kind, a bulletin board system for you youngsters. And the same thing happens today. It just happens to be IP addresses and port addresses, but they're doing the same thing. Phishing attacks, we're not talking about spear phishing, but phishing widespread, it's a shotgun approach. And the idea is it's so automated that they're literally trying to attack thousands and thousands and thousands of companies with literally the click of a button. So it's very easy for that 72% to get to 72% because it's purely automated. But then you think about 28%. There's still more than a quarter of them are individuals that physically have to do the actions themselves. That's a massive number in comparison. So I really think that that's a huge number, because it talk about a specific individual doing one thing to one company, as opposed to some guy in a hoodie at 3 a.m. in the morning who decides he wants to send an email out to 10,000 companies to see what happens. Insiders are a big threat. So let's do this. We've got a Q&A here a little bit here. Most of the questions were around that I've got here is get a recorded version of the webinar as well as the presentation, and the answer to both of those is yes. Someone from Veriato will be sending out an email after the webinar to make sure you guys have access to both of those, so look for that. We do have a drone giveaway, and the drone is going to be given away to, I'm going to murder this last name, so I'm apologizing in advance. I think it's Harold Batenga. I hope I said it right, Harold. If I did, you can say, hey, thumbs up, or no, you misspelled it and ruined it completely, but I think I said it right. And everyone else, you're all still winners in our book. You just don't win the drone. And then while we're closing out here, Jim, I mentioned your stuff at the beginning here. I built a slide for you real quick. I thought it might be helpful to some of the people. Would you talk a little bit about the services that you provide real quick for the audience?
I provide insider threat program development and management training. The reason I put development, some people haven't developed programs, they're just starting. Some people have developed programs and want to enhance. So my training will help any company, government organization, business that wants to develop manage or enhance their program. It's been taught to probably over 550 organizations. It's almost like I'm providing you insider threat program in a box. It's not death by PowerPoint. I'm providing templates, support documents for the program. As one student said, I don't have to do the work. You did it for me. So it's gotten great reviews. Go www.insiderthreatdefense.us. You can find more about the training. It's gotten excellent reviews. Also provide services, consulting services, helping companies put in programs, providing training to upper management, on the concept of programs, such on. I also do insider threat risk assessments, that kind of stuff.
Excellent. And as the last slide here that I've got is we're doing another webinar August 11th. If you'd like to join, I'll be talking about monitoring employees in a remote workplace. I've put a really easy bit.ly link there for you if you'd like to go take a look at the abstract and the stuff that we'll be covering, and as well as you can sign up for that. So with that, hey, Jim, thank you very much for a great conversation today. I really appreciate all your input. This was really good, very educational for the audience. We had got almost everybody, I think, stayed to this bitter end right now. So must have been worthwhile. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate it.
Yep. Glad to have you. And you guys in the audience, thank you for attending. Hope it was informative. Take advantage of Jim and his insider threat training as well. And we'll catch you on the next webinar. So thank you very much. This concludes today's webcast.